colleague sent me an article that's out in the lay press, and it's all about when we can safely relax the masking rules for children in schools. And it's on the heels of the Super Bowl, where we safely relax the masking rules for so many people to enjoy a sporting event, of course. Now, the Super Bowl was something special. You didn't have to be vaccinated to go. You could test out. In other words, if you tested negative, even if you're unvaccinated, you could attend. And the same is true, my understanding is the Oscars are going to be the same way. God forbid we make these elite people in California have to take the vaccine to go to these things. The only place we're going to enforce that standard is in the schools, because the governor has already had executive order that says once it's fully approved, we're going to have 12 and up mandatory vaccination in schools. There's no test to stay option there. And there's proposed legislation. We're going to drop it down all the way to 5 by the end of the year. No test to stay exemption, and no exemption if you had COVID in the past. Well. Once again, the rules are a lot stricter to go to that terrible place called school than it is to go to a sporting event or the Oscars. And that to me is a deep contradiction. That's why I think a lot of people are going to get more and more angry with the politicians who are setting the policy, because it's abundantly clear that children who are powerless can be subject to all sorts of restrictions, but powerful people don't want to be. They're happy to tweet selfies of themselves without masks. They're happy to make policies that exempt themselves, but they'd love for children to be masked and vaxxed to even go to school. It's the worst policy I've ever seen. It's the most unfair policy I've ever seen. It promotes the interests of the rich and powerful, adult interests, elite interests, and it sacrifices children. But it does so for no real gain, actually. I don't think it actually serves even a broader societal gain. I don't know what purpose it serves other than it's theater. It's signaling that we care about it without actually doing things that matter when they would have mattered. And at this point, there are only a few things left that we could be doing. One would be, I think, boosting and vaccinating older people, which is the missing space. But all this stuff around children and putting the greatest restrictions on the people who face the least risk from the virus, I think that's misguided. I've written about that in a number of op-eds lately. One you should check out, which is on Barry Weiss's Substack. Another you should read in Tablet Magazine, and then also on College Kids and Time Magazine today. I want to talk about an article, though, that somebody sent me, and this was about when it's safe to remove the restrictions. And the interviewer was asking the expert, how do we know masking works in schools? And they said, well, there are lots of observational studies that support it, so the totality of the evidence is supportive. Well, not really, actually. There's a very nice study from Spain that is not supportive, and many of the studies you're citing are all terrible. And I've deconstructed many of them on this channel and on my Substack. They're bad studies. So you have a set of bad studies that leads you to a belief, but that's not the totality of the evidence. That's the totality of the opinion. Lots of people have a strong opinion, and then they generate observational evidence that meets that opinion. Just today, with my colleague Nicholas Zaworski from Case Western University, we published a paper about retrospective observational studies in cancer medicine. And all we did was change the analytical plan. We analyzed this retrospective data in several ways, and we showed for a number of clinical questions, you could get both answer depending on your analytical plan. You could get the answer that it helps or the answer that it's harmful, depending on how you choose to adjust for variables, the different types of statistical analyses you perform, etc., etc. You can read the paper, but I don't want to get too technical. But the point is this: when you have a hot question and people feel passionate about it, of course they're going to scrape low-quality retrospective data, and they're going to find some way to find the association they believe in. But that doesn't mean it's true, and it doesn't mean it's a totality of evidence. It just means that there's a lot of strong opinions in that space. When the opinions are heavily loaded, you really need robust, bias-resistant studies. You need randomized studies, natural experiments. You need that level of evidence. You don't have that in this case, so I wouldn't draw that conclusion. The other thing I see is that this person analogizes masking in schools to, car safety. But there's a big difference, actually. There's a fundamentally big difference, because if it is true that masking in schools, quote unquote, works, what that means by works is it delays the time until children encounter the virus. But a child who lives a normal life will eventually encounter the virus. They're going to have it happen to them, probably many times in their lives, and they will build immunity, and they're mostly going to do well because healthy kids mostly do well from this virus. In contrast, the safety that you use in a car seat, for instance, that's protecting the child in a period of time where they could be in an accident and their bodies are too small, apparently, for the regular seatbelt to work, for instance. And then they grow out of that and they're no longer vulnerable, and you've protected them during the key period. You didn't delay I think, a bad outcome. You averted a bad outcome in the event of a car accident. That's a very different thing. The other reason it's different is that it is a way to mitigate the harm of an intervention you have deployed, which is the rapid use of a rapid automobile. In this other case, you're trying to mitigate the harm of an intervention or of a thing that nature has deployed, or maybe it leaked from a lab. But either way, it's coming from outside. It's not coming from engineering. And the standards of evidence there are more in the realm of biomedicine, where if you were going to impose restrictions on people, and by the way, no one has ever said that we should ban kids from wearing masks if they and their parents choose to. We're talking about the mandatory, the compulsory use of masks. The burden is on you to show that it actually works. And there's a pre-existing body of literature. There's also randomized controlled trials in adults where cloth masking didn't work. So it would be a bit bizarre that the mask that didn't work in rural Bangladesh with no pre-existing immunity and no vaccination suddenly works in a younger age group in a country with widespread adult vaccination. Would be a bit odd, I would think. And it would also be odd that it would suddenly work even though the preponderance of the pre-existing evidence was negative, as we detail in a paper in the working paper on cloth masking. The last point. This person was talking about how now's not the time that it's safe. The cases need to be below some threshold, obviously. That threshold, the threshold. The problem with that is that no one has any idea what the threshold is. The threshold will be make-believe. Because to know that there's a threshold above which something works and below which it doesn't, you would have to do many studies, or a really big study with the ability to detect an interaction by prevalence. No one has done such a study. Nobody knows it works above a number, and nobody knows it doesn't work below a number. And so that's just crazy. I know the CDC is probably thinking about this real quick because they see their political fortunes dwindling in front of their eyes as politicians go to schools and take picture where only the politician's beaming face is visible and the kids are not. So the CDC is thinking of a way to peel off the mandates. But they need to save face, and they won't be able to admit, I think, that we never knew this worked and we failed you, American people, because we never did a cluster randomized trial. They'll need a way to save face, and that way to save face will be to put some threshold in place to say that the conditions on the ground changed. It wasn't that we were foolish in our implementation and we actually never studied it. And so I think that's what they're going to do. But I don't think we should forget that the reality of the science is that they failed to deliver convincing science that it worked. And that might have been forgivable for the first few months of the pandemic, but 2 years into it, I think it's hard to believe it's forgivable. It brings me to my final point, beliefs. I've been talking about this recently and thinking about it more. I think one of the key problems in this space is that people don't know why they believe what they believe. I think that people who say that, well, there are lots of studies that show masking works, and then you ask them to demonstrate those studies, they're going to need a minute. They got to go look them up. They actually don't know them off the top of their head. And to be honest with you, I don't think they read them, and then I don't think they read them competently with sort of the comb of someone who is approaching it as a scientific skeptic, who's critical of the claim. I think they are taking the abstract conclusions at face value, and they're picking the abstracts that they can find after an internet search after you press them to demonstrate the evidence. I don't think they actually know the evidence off the top of their head. One of the studies that actually this person was citing was the Wisconsin study, which was the study where they reopened schools with masks and they had very little transmission. And they claimed that showed that the masks worked. But in science, you'd have to have a school system similar where they didn't wear masks, so you would see the effect of the mask and not all the other stuff. You need a counterfactual, and the paper didn't have one, so it's kind of a ridiculous paper to cite, to claim that it's working without anything to compare it against what would have happened were it not for the intervention. That's kind of science 101. But anyway, my point, beliefs. I think many of us don't know where our beliefs come from. And a lot of things we believe without having interrogated the evidence deeply. I think that's true for everyone. It's very difficult to know the evidence for all the things you believe and all the things you do. And that's understandable. It's totally acceptable that you wouldn't know all the real reason why you're doing what you're doing. But the moment you start getting in the business of broad sweeping policies and mandating that other people do it too, not just you or the people you care about, but other people do it. They all have to do it. Well, then I think you're under some obligation to ask yourself why you feel so fervently about that. What is the basis of your belief that would be beneficial? And I think most people have to admit that they don't really know for sure. They just feel as if there's a consensus. They feel as if scientists say. They feel as if. But they don't know the underlying evidence. And when you look at the underlying evidence, I think the few people who do, they need to look at it critically and carefully and cautiously and skeptically, as a scientist does. You put all that together, I think that one of the biggest problems in this pandemic was the science communicator class, who like to, I think, be in the spotlight and want to do good. I mean, I don't even think it's all ill-motivated or narcissism. I do think they want to be good and use their talents and often their dexterity with language to advance, I think, what they think are good solutions. But I think the places that they lack critical appraisal, they lack the habit of critical appraisal, they lack the habit of reading articles, they lack the habit of reading things critically, and they lack sort of some broad, sort of Bayesian baseline sense of what people can accomplish in the face of Mother Nature. What is the probability that our interventions are generally successful? Do our interventions work better or worse as you drift into ages where compliance dwindles, where there's all this sort of compensatory things that may happen? What happens? What is the burden to show benefits and harms historically in science and biomedicine? When we impose public health interventions, who has the burden to show benefit? Who shoulders the burden of the evidence, particularly years into doing something? And then finally, the toughest one, which is the sense that not only should there be proportionality based on risk by age, which this, I think, violates, but also the sense of consistency and contradiction, and that when huge swaths of the public are throwing away the restrictions, as is happening right now in California, and you're continuing to impose them in the most vulnerable, marginalized group of public school kids who face the least risk, you really have to demonstrate supraordinary evidence that would make sense, that it works in that group and doesn't work for the rest of us who don't need it, and you have not even come close to marshaling such evidence. In fact, you have evidence that's so lacking that one would doubt, even if the rest of us were doing it, that these kids had to do it at all. And that's, in fact, the position of the United Kingdom. So I guess I do think that there is a huge problem in journalism. The problem is that they're going to the experts who are visible, but the experts who are visible are not adroit at data appraisal, at clinical trials appraisal. I think the same thing's true with myocarditis in vaccine, which is I see nothing but misconceptions about. Look, what we're talking about, the crux of the issue. The highest risk of myocarditis vaccine is the dose 2 in boys of a certain age, 12 to 24. So what that means is, in one arm, you've got all the kids who had one dose, and then you're going to divide them into two groups. The group that's getting the dose 2 and the group that doesn't. And then, eventually, the group that doesn't will have a breakthrough sometime in their lives. I think that's inevitable. And the group that does will eventually have a breakthrough sometimes in their lives. I think that's inevitable. And you need to think which group in aggregate is going to have more myocarditis, pericarditis, bad outcomes, etc. And you have to remember that the first dose has already markedly reduced the risk of hospitalization. There's New England Journal data on this. You need to also think, what is the additional dose of what is the additional benefit on the hard outcome of hospitalization or death from the second dose, and how do you offset that? And how is that offset by the known toxicity and harm? And then what happens if you had kids who had 2 doses and you're starting like dose 3 or no dose 3, or 2 doses and an Omicron, dose 3 versus no dose 3? You need to think about it that way. Making silly comparisons where you compare 2 doses or boosters to somebody who never got any of that and what happened to them, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about among the people who've gotten 1, should they get the second, and when should they get the second, and how do you mitigate the harms? And I think that's something people have conceptual difficulties with. So overall, my themes here are: newspapers are failing us. We have nakedly visible contradictions in policy. The Oscars, the Super Bowl, what's going on to California kids, the California kid pending vaccine mandate. Naked contradiction. Naked contradiction. It would take supraordinary evidence to justify the naked contradiction. That evidence does not exist. In fact, even ordinary evidence does not exist to support an intervention 2 years later. And for these reasons, a sensible policy would be to admit that we have failed to generate said evidence. It's not that, and that's why we're peeling back the restriction. We're not setting some case count in place because that wouldn't be based on evidence because we didn't generate that evidence. We failed. We failed you to generate evidence. This is what I want the CDC to say. We have failed you to run a cluster randomized trial of masking kids in school. There are many, many observational studies. They are all grievously flawed. Not a single one can adjust for all of the innumerable differences between communities that choose to institute these mandates and communities that didn't. They're just flawed. Many of them are even more flawed than that. They didn't adjust for vaccination rates in the staff or the students. They don't even have good data on cases. They're looking at different outcomes that smell of cherry picking, like outbreaks, not case counts themselves. Some of them have defects in the number of studies they looked at, as David Zweig noted in The Atlantic. They don't even know how many schools they're actually counting. There's some errors in their counting. They're not sharing their data, etc., as David Zweig notes. This is a total evidence failure. So the CDC should say, we have failed you. It's our job not only to guide policy, but to reduce uncertainty and give people answers, not just for this pandemic, for the pandemics to come. The future, for the future of our species and knowledge, we have failed you. And we cannot continue to fail you, because what's worse than a failure is perpetuating a failure year after year. And so we will rescind our mandate. It is now grossly in contradiction to other societal changes that are happening all around us. It doesn't make sense. It lacks proportionality. There is no superordinary evidence. There's not even ordinary evidence. We have failed you. We apologize. And I'm very sorry. And all of us involved should be terminated, and we should get new people to work at this agency. That's what I want to hear. But instead, what I hear is terrible things, that we're going to set some threshold, or that this is the evidence that supports it, and this expert, quote unquote, who may or may not have read, but likely didn't read most of these studies and certainly didn't read them critically, believes this. And this is what the journalism is parroting. And that's not good. Because the difference between what I want to hear and what I'm hearing is just a difference that's going to be like a pebble in our shoe. We're just going to keep walking, and it's just going to keep poking us and poking us and poking us. And eventually, people are going to get really sick of it. And I worry that when they get sick of it, their backlash will not be targeted. It won't just be to remove the pebble. It might be to throw the whole shoe away. And I think we see hints of that. We see some states that are actually talking about dismantling a whole vaccination program, or dismantling all requirements for all vaccinations in all contexts. Now, I'm critical of a mandate for this particular vaccination in young people, and I'm critical of mandates, I think, for this particular situation because of where we are in this moment. But I'm not sure that I'm going to like to live in a world where we have massive rates of people who don't complete childhood immunization. I think that will be a terrible world. And so to get the pebble out of our shoe, which is a pebble that the elites have caused and that the elites could take out by admitting their failure, we're going to throw our whole shoe away, and then we're going to end up with a calloused, blistered foot, much like our ancestors. So I think that's not going to be good. I also think that science itself is in a crisis. And the crisis is that there are people who are not very good at it, who are like really setting the narrative, and that's very much a problem. It's very much a problem across all the media spaces I watch. And it concerns me as somebody who cares a great deal about science. The greatest way we have to ascertain what's going on in the world, and a method for reducing uncertainty. And to me, the most anti-scientific thing I routinely hear is the idea that we can't do that study you call for. Wouldn't be right, wouldn't be fair, wouldn't be ethical, wouldn't be sound to do that study. And what they're saying is that we have to live in the same ignorance we live in now. And I reject that. I think it would be right, it would be sane. In fact, it's unethical not to do the study. Not doing the study has led to the crisis we're in right now, where no one has any sound basis for removing the policy, and people are starting to dig deep into their playbook to think of stories that sound plausible to, I think, deceive the public yet again. And that's not what you want. You want credible, randomized data to actually have answered this question in advance. You needed to generate that data. And there were many calls to generate the data from the BMJ, Margaret McCartney, from John Ioannidis and Florian Nadeau and Iona Cristia, who wrote a nice paper about that as well. Many calls to generate that data. Those calls were not heeded. And here we are in this muck, in the mire, in a bizarre world where somebody says, well, we have to be at the right number. And the right number is right over here. Let me just find that number for you. I got it right here. That's not science. And then you want the public to believe that some scientific process went into that. And I don't think you're going to be able to sell that. So those are my thoughts in the moment on this space. This is what you get on this channel. You get an uncut video. There's no cuts. There's only rarely a cut when somebody bangs on my front door or something like that. But I try not to have any cuts because I think it's important to see the process by which someone is articulating their sentiment. And I go on these channels and I see all these hypercuts, and I don't even know if the person who's speaking is even articulate if you didn't splice them 1,000 times while they say things. So I don't like to put the cuts in. Also don't have the time to put the cuts in. That's the other problem. But I do think it's important to think through the reasoning process and why I view it the way I do. And that's what you get on this channel. You get this, an associate professor of epibiostats, a practicing hemonc doc, walking through his thought process. Someone who's published a few hundred papers. I think we're at 340 or something like that now. So I've done a fair bit. I know when it goes well. I know a lot of the things when it goes wrong. And if you like that, you should like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. ring that bell. Until next time.